you so much, Jan, for this kind introduction of all of us, and also for pointing in the first part of the program to those short bios in the program, so that we can dive now straight into the actors, institutions, and networks in and for science diplomacy, which is the topic of our panel. Welcome, everyone. I'm Eva Bosbach. I'm honored to join the actors here on stage who all practice science diplomacy, representing a German university, the University of Cologne for North America, where we are trying to do our part in science diplomacy, not only by having a number of international research collaborations and student exchanges and organizing events together with policymakers and scientists, but also, for example, with our university president, Rector Gilberto Mukherjee, at the same time being the president of the German Academic Exchange Service, and also with these active regional liaison offices. So not only with me in New York for North America, but also in China, India, Ghana, and Egypt. And last but not least, we are also a proud main supporter of the German Centers of Research and Innovation, including the one in New York, who is organizing this Future Forum. So thank you so much, Chris, Jan, Julia, and Saskia, and also Rebecca Theis, our former intern, who is the editorial, now how was this correct term? Editorial assistant, I think was the correct term. So thank you all for being such wonderful partners. Also thank you, Ona, for hosting us here, and Christian for both of your flash talks. I do have questions, and I will get back to you, but let me start us off with a question to Bill Colglazier. So after hearing those flash talks about some ways how science diplomacy can be implemented and practiced, I would like us to take a step back and look at the concept's history and how it became so popular in the recent years. Bill, you are a theoretic physicist involved in science diplomacy since the 1980s, and I just learned today that you just retired. Thank you so much for your service as a senior scholar in the Center for Science Diplomacy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, which, together with the Royal Society in 2010, published the paper New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, which is regarded until today by many scholars as the key publication in this field, make the distinction that we already heard about science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, so that ideally political decisions would be informed by research results. Politicians paved the way for better and more international scientific collaboration, and that then in reverse leads to a better diplomacy and international collaboration. It also spoke about the key actors in science diplomacy. So that was in 2010. So maybe you can tell us what, in your opinion, has changed in those 14 years regarding the key actors, institutions, and networks, and also which stakeholders do you see at the forefront in the US science diplomacy going forward?
Thank you, Eva. There's just one sort of a beginning, although I just stepped down as editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy, sciencediplomacy.org at AAAS. I want to recommend to all of you, there's a special issue that is now on the website in September with about 20 articles from different actors, including from the Global South, on perspectives on science diplomacy. It's well worth reading. I have a short article there on United States, my priorities for the United States science diplomacy for the next 5 years. It connects also to an earlier on my last editorial in Science and Diplomacy was on science diplomacy for the future. So in coming now to Eva's question, why I'm especially interested in actors, in institutions, in networks. I take a very pragmatic view of science diplomacy. I love the old definition from 15 years ago in the journal, but to me, the things that I find most important are what are the goals that are trying to be accomplished in an initiative? Who are the actors? What is the strategy? And how to actually go about it in terms of a long-term plan or roadmap. Back in 2019, the World Science Forum, I sort of laid out what I consider the priorities for the world in science diplomacy, and I was reflecting back on that, thinking about now in this new era, what would I recommend for the United States? And we've heard about why we're in a new era. It's an era of competition, conflict, and even wars, but also with the fact that we have this acceleration of the science and technology enterprise, the hyper-acceleration, particularly with emerging technologies. And you compare that time frame with the time frame of which our governments and societies can actually deal with these problems, and they're totally out of sync. So it makes it even more challenging in this new era we're facing. In that article on Science Diplomacy of the Future, I sort of reflected on the 4 decades or so I've sort of been involved. I was sort of motivated by great scientists who were also, in my view, science diplomats. They never served in government, but particularly the ones that were involved in the Manhattan Project in World War II, they spent a lot of time outside of science in Track II dialogues with Soviet scientists, Russian scientists on nuclear arms control. And so they, at least for a young person in the field, they were sort of an inspiration as mentors of why it's important, even if you're a scientist and always going to stay in science, to try to actually make a contribution in the big issues that face society. So on Eva's question, what is new now in terms of actors, institutions, and networks in this new era? And I'll just mention a couple of the priorities that I listed in terms of priorities for what I said was the United States science diplomacy for the next 5 years, looking at purely U.S. national interests. The first one, and I had the same one back in 2019, this issue of the threat of nuclear weapons. I was a freshman in college during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now I think this era is probably even more dangerous than we were back in 1962. And what made a difference in sort of what I call the golden era that sort of followed when there was active engagement between scientists and Track II discussions between the two countries, when Gorbachev came to power, the Soviet scientists turned out to be his key scientific advisors. And that, plus pugwash, sort of helped make the way for what was sort of the new arms control agreements that occurred in the 1990s. Now we see almost all of those disappearing. So there's a very important role, in my view, for non-governmental actors, at least, trying to maintain a dialogue. The U.S. National Academies still continues to have their Committee on International Security Cooperation, CSAC, which still continues to have a dialogue, all done virtually now, between U.S. and Russian scientists dealing with the issues related to nuclear arms control. Maybe there'll be another window of opportunity in the future when progress can be made where we get back to real agreements, but right now it's certainly in a dangerous period, so I certainly put it at the top of the list. Just to mention another one on expanding engagement with countries that are in conflict or competition with the United States, and particularly think of the U.S. and China, of course, but it's not the only one. Again, it's really important for non-governmental actors to try to continue, particularly in basic research, particularly in working in areas that perhaps dealing with global challenges that are still possible between countries. The scientific organizations outside of the government are actually been encouraged by the U.S. government to continue dialogues. For example, U.S. National Academies with Chinese scientists on what they call planetary health. The AAAS is doing it with its comparable organization in China. So the more we can do to maintain, what I wanted to really mention was scientific societies, the American Physical Society, where I'm involved. They got 60 physical societies around the world, including China and a number of others, to lay down policies and principles for engaging in international scientific cooperation. So the fact that we can maintain this dialogue between countries, even in these very challenging times, is really important. The one, in terms of the current era, one thing that's actually on the positive side, it's made politicians much more interested in funding collaboration, particularly in the tech area, between democratic allies. We've heard a little bit about this morning from Jean, talking from the State Department, but the agreements that are occurring between not only working in basic research, but also in technology development as well. Of course, there are always the challenges of competition if it affects future technologies that are important for the economy. So again, there's a very important role and maintained a role for U.S. scientific agencies in the U.S. government to continue their emphasis on trying to maintain a dialogue. The last one I'll mention before trying to talk too long is increasing foresight analysis and dialogue between countries. When I was in the State Department a decade ago, one of the most interesting things I was involved in was engaging with intelligence agencies on trying to predict what the rapid changes in science and technology, the implications they might have that would affect foreign policy, could affect peace and war and disruptions. One thing I learned from it was actually humility. Back then, we did not anticipate the disruptive impact of social media, so it's very difficult to try to make predictions about the future. But I think it's an important role for the scientific community to try to at least alert the government and the public on what some of the implications are, both the good and the bad, that are coming from these incredibly fast advances. And as part of that, I mean, another bit of humility, something that I learned, I thought with the pandemic, the United States would do better than any other country dealing with the pandemic. And of course, I forgot about the impact not only of politics and ideology and values can be tremendously disruptive. And so now the problems that we see in terms of public trust in science have sort of emerged from the fact of ignoring the importance of having expertise from the humanities, from social sciences involved in efforts at science diplomacy. Lastly, I should mention now that the private sector, of course, private sectors are become even more important actors. When I was in the government, there was a wonderful project that was by the Intel Corporation in Vietnam. They had their largest manufacturing facility outside the United States in Vietnam, in Hanoi, Ho Chi, and they found out that the technicians and the engineers that from Vietnam did not have all the skills they needed. So Intel took it on, brought in the U.S. government, the Vietnamese government, they brought in U.S. universities, Vietnamese universities, essentially to try to build the capabilities of engineering universities in Vietnam so it could provide the skills that were needed in terms of a high-tech manufacturing facility. Now I think it's because of the challenges in the world, it's much more difficult to try to create those partnerships with the private sector, particularly the partnerships between the government, the private sector as well, and the non-governmental sector to do that kind of capacity building that's needed. So it's certainly more difficult for science diplomacy, but I think, again, the key element, of course, are what are we trying to accomplish? Who are the actors that we can engage? What is the strategy? And what are the actions? And again, politics can overwhelm all of this, but hopefully there are windows of opportunity that have occurred in the past. So even sometimes when you lay the seed a number of years ago, actually you find out that it can bloom when these diplomatic windows appear.
Well, thank you, Bill. You mentioned that the times now are more dangerous than in the 1950s, and you mentioned the word disruptive many times, such as the disruptive impact of social media. We have another disruptive force that is all over the place, the artificial intelligence, when we think about future of science, collaboration, and quite frankly, our society as a whole. So I will turn to you, Marcus, with this one. We will all agree, I think, that AI has already changed the way we work, we study, do research, do business, collaborate. And you are an esteemed AI researcher and also have advised the US government agencies on this topic. So from your experience, where do we stand and how prepared is today's political leadership for this technological revolution? Aren't we always just basically playing catch since tech will always be ahead of policy?
That's a great question. I think that it's an apt analogy, Bill, to the nuclear Cold War arms race, and I think these are constantly recurring themes now. If you look at the National Security Memorandum on AI that was just released by the White House, it indicates that we're still in a reactive state to this rapid progression and ascent of AI. But we are showing a trend towards taking it more and more seriously. But what I'd like to see us do from a science diplomacy perspective and also from a foreign policy perspective is to start to set a North Star or a guiding light and be proactive about how we're establishing policy and how we're transmuting science into strategy. And so I think science diplomacy has a big role to play there by helping policymakers understand, and our leaders to understand what's happening in the frontier labs, what are the true capabilities of these models, what kind of agency do they have, what kind of role are they going to play in sort of the game theory of this arms race. I think you could make the argument that it's essentially been the starting gun to the arms race, this National Security Memorandum of these mandates of what adoption needs to happen and how AI needs to be handled in all the respective agencies. In addition to that, I think if we think about transformational leadership is really the framework that we need, the leadership framework to set that North Star, that guiding light. What are some examples from our nation's history? Well, if you look towards an example like JFK, which is a commonly used example in the scientific literature for transformational leadership, it's this very visionary style of leadership that helps to articulate a vision for the future that's aspirational, and it also inspires people to map their individual contribution onto the common goals of the greater organization. And I think in eras of technological revolution, which we very much are in the midst of, transformational leadership is really the framework that we need to look toward in order to be able to handle something like this pace of innovation. If you think about it, like the moon, saying that we will go to the moon, that's setting a North Star, that's setting a guiding light. And we need something similar in the age of AI to be able to clearly visualize what that future state looks like, and we can only do that when we understand what's happening in the frontier labs, and then to articulate a plan of how we're going to get there to that ideal future. Because collaboration versus escalation is not a guarantee. That we have to work towards and strive towards alignment and ethics in order to achieve cooperation. So I think that these are key. I mean, as a final thought to that, I mean, if we think about, what if we had gone to Mars together rather than to the moon as individual nations? How much further along would we be, and what kind of conflict could we potentially have avoided? And so I think that's what we need to do, is work with policymakers as science diplomats to enable that future by bringing to the fore what's happening in science and transmute that into strategy that our policymakers can enact.
Yes, and if we go to Mars together, it will probably be the young researchers who do that. So that brings me to you, Derya. But you said something interesting. You said we have entered the arms race on AI. And I just want to pause and have us all digest that term, and probably we should all look at that memorandum that was just released 3 days ago by the White House, because that might be something that we not normally as regular citizens get to see and get to know where they think this is all going. I really like your vision of the North Star and the guiding light. It is evident that the AI has caused some uncertainty already before the arms race analogy, and for companies, for businesses, for us regular citizens. Derya, this development, when we pair it with the geopolitical challenges, right, such as the shift in power dynamics between the Western alliances and the Eastern autocracies, the research security, research unsecurity, all that, that all, I would argue, directly affects individual career paths of scientists. So since you are a professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology at George Washington University, you teach a course on science diplomacy. So everybody in the audience who wants to explore the topic further after today, please talk to Derya if you can sign up for a class on science diplomacy. And you also serve as the regional representative as Eurex's North America. So you know firsthand what's on the minds of young researchers who want to work internationally. So do you see this disruptive or these disruptive tendencies influencing the students and the young scientists, influencing the talent mobility? And if yes, then what can we do? What can we do to support them, to help?
Hey, yeah, I think it's a really big question and difficult to answer in just 5 or 10 minutes, Eva, because I'm also a researcher. I came from Turkey, so I know the difficulties of how these researchers migrate from one country or another, And your access gave me a really good perspective how we should really help these researchers in terms of finding their ways and in terms of teaming up with the other researchers as well. So this is one of the most important things that the EU, one of the key players in AI also, mentions. But I really want to focus on, first of all, coming to talent. I think while we are talking about the geopolitical crisis, I think the geography of migration has changed. And all the researchers, not only the researchers, I'm talking about talent. And it includes not only scientists, because we should also include students, international students, engineers. This is not limited to only the, when we say scientists, so it's broader. So all these dynamics, the internationalization of higher education, especially the asymmetric power between global north and south, the rapid change in STI, they are all based at all level. All the governments need this talent. So there is right now a big competition for talent. So how these students or the researchers are affected from this is that they really want to attract and train best, talent. The US, Canada was the magnet for this, but the game has changed. And we are talking about AI, but right now governments have to act so fast because all these technologies need to be adapted, need to be, produced and, shared and controlled. But at any level or stage of this, AI or other, emerging technologies, talent is the key. So how the countries are really trying to, this also the global, uncertainties, global change. We are all talking about talent and migration, and the governments, I can tell you, this big competition is getting so deep and so hard. And now they have all shifted their, destinations. Right now, I have so many friends from Turkey that they're not coming anymore to the US, but to Qatar, to South Korea, to even Brazil, because there's so many other generous, very open, and not for themselves, for their families, very good, generous funding, scholars, and everything. But this is a big competition. This is not only attracting or retaining them. Where I'm going to also come to a very important point is that this is a governmental level policy, and we should not ignore, because it all going to, when we are talking about AI, we say, okay, computers, but computers really generates machines, but people generates future, right? So we really need to keep them connected, team up, what the Europe says, and working so hard through Euraccess, through other, projects. But I think we need to, as everything is evolving so fast, I also want to mention that the actors that Bill, you mentioned, we should also take into consideration the importance of diasporas. When I move to a country, I really want to create or engage in one, big group because of belonging, because of sharing, but this is not as simple as this. We understood the importance of these scientific diasporas during the COVID. And I can give you some examples. For example, from Spain, there is Rieck, there is Ecusa, and they have more than like 8,000 Spanish people in 18 countries. And in a crisis time like COVID, they can come together and they can help their governments in terms of conveying some scientific information to their policy levels from abroad. So these are all about researchers, about policy level, about global, because they're all going to help to tackle the global challenges. So we should really add these big professional networks, as Bill also mentioned, diasporas as new actors. We should not really stuck on the ministries or international organizations. They need to connect and team up in different levels, because when we are talking about talent or network, because network is net worth for the really countries, and we should take the consideration of this. And especially in science advice mechanisms, I think they're really very important. resources for the governments. So if they want to be engaged in the policies, the governments should integrate these diasporas or networks or associations as a part of their policies. Otherwise, if sometimes it doesn't come from top down because of the sustainability, I think it's not going to work out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You also mentioned that talent is the key. That's, I think, a great guiding principle for us. And also that funding is the key, right? To see where researchers and students actually will be going. I have a very quick follow-up to you, Derya. I would ask you for a very short answer, but actually the topic could have a long answer, but just in the sake of time, because I know that you kind of have also a second hat here, because you also have done extensive research on the role of women in science diplomacy, and it's an important topic. So maybe you can just tell us, I think we all know why it is important to engage more women in science diplomacy, but what are some strategies that you have seen that work and that maybe others could follow as best practice?
I think this is another important aspect of science diplomacy, because when it started, like the beginning of this century, we were all saying science diplomacy is good, it creates, it was like a remedy, and, but right now we are really criticizing science diplomacy in terms of not very inclusive, not really taking into consideration the other aspects like gender aspects. So what I think is women in general brings a really diverse perspective at any level of these innovation or AI, at any technological, developments. So we should be very inclusive. There's some good news and bad news. If you look at the statistics, right? If you look at the UNESCO science report or SHE reports by the European Union, you see that the percentage of women graduates in AI, in STEM fields, it's higher and it's really good. But when you look at the numbers, the percentage of workplace, women are just represented around 15%, from nearly 40-50%. So what is the difference? It's all about the different obstacles, but they are really very structural, and it needs to be changed. And one of the other problems that, because of Vista, I really want to mention it, underrepresentation at many levels, not only workplace, but also international organizations, big science projects, and diplomacy level. Vista is so important. In the opening remarks, we also heard about it, so I don't want to repeat, but 2 years ago, just within 2 years, they reached to around 50 members. And of course, it is a good example because it shows that there are women who are really engaging in diplomacy, and they want to increase the visibility. They want to enhance the partnerships between countries, but taking into consideration of the women and gender perspective. They have been becoming role models, but it is not enough. What we have been talking is really from the very north perspective, what I see. Because when we are talking about, talent, the gap, knowledge gap is so huge in Global South. And what we really need to do is we need to support, as in the also, the Eugene also mentioned, there is more need to support women and also talent in other underdeveloped or developing countries, because otherwise I think this gap is not going to be solved very quickly. And we need more models like Vista in other countries. And there's another good news is that more countries are empowering women and they have more gender sensitive policies. It's a good news. So they also want this as a soft power, if we look from the science diplomacy perspective, but they should really be a role model for their region. We are not going to lose anything, and they're really going to show that with this, support, we can also have a less gender gap.
Thank you. Please, everybody, Google Vista and join the Women in Science Diplomacy group. And you also said, we need role models and women who are really engaged. I mean, Derya, you and Ona, you're both shining examples of women in science diplomacy. Thank you for doing what you do. So, Ona, I'm turning to you now because you really bring a unique perspective to this panel by being the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub, having us also, I think that institution is really, I think we can say, pioneering in this very targeted advancement of science diplomacy. So you have established a number of collaborations, such as with diplomats in Japan, Belgium, Switzerland, Rwanda. So would you say these are partnerships as we know them, or would you rather say these are new forms of collaboration, of international collaboration? So I guess my question is about quantity versus quality in science diplomacy, also your mission, and also if science diplomacy can maybe bring some stability in this, as our subtitle of the event says, era of technological disruption.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question, Eva. So, you know, really the Johns Hopkins, you know, Science Diplomacy Hub here, you know, we try to ensure that we emphasize this concept of subnational diplomacy, right? Because it is not something that's easy to do necessarily. So what I mean by that is we have the Johns Hopkins University. For example, we collaborate with Ghent University in Belgium. And that is done through, for example, our collaborative projects with the Embassy of Belgium. Likewise, with the Embassy of Japan. And we are collaborating now with the University of Tokyo, right? By affiliation, for example, or other ways. Same thing with Switzerland. I mean, the embassy in that case is not really involved as deeply, but we have University of St. Gallen that we're working on healthcare management topics, and like, as I mentioned, like large language models, and how public reporting is affected by this disruptive technology. So we're working exactly on that. And I do believe that such efforts can be new forms of science diplomacy itself, right? So we get many questions in terms of, you know, do you have to be, let's say, positioned within an embassy to do science diplomacy? And I think by using our example of a Johns Hopkins Science Diplomacy Hub, is that no, you don't. You can really start something like this using an academic institution, right? So one of the benefits, and I'll highlight this again, of doing this, for example, as Johns Hopkins University, is that we have this completely neutral platform that allows us to host these conversations with different stakeholders. And really, I mean, you can have, you know, open thoughts here. We don't maybe necessarily even have to have the Chatham House rules, you know, announcement in the beginning of the session sometimes. So yes, so the short answer is we are practicing, I think, a very interesting angle of diplomacy, so subnational diplomacy. And I hope, yes, that this is going to be this glue. So I always say that science diplomacy is this necessary glue that will allow us to keep conversations going when other tracks stop, right? So I think this is one of the examples of the efforts that we can continue doing. And hopefully that leads to not something, again, as I mentioned, short term, but also long term. And, you know, it's important to start somewhere. So we started and we're growing. And I think that's our vision in general. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Hopefully others can also start such hubs. That would be a nice development. Christian, last but not least, you are an associate professor at the chair of War Studies at the University of Potsdam. I mean, if it wasn't Halloween, this would almost sound scary. So happy Halloween, by the way, to all of you. Now, we have learned from the other panelists that there are many current developments that can reasonably be cause of some concerns regarding the future of international scientific collaboration, while at the same time development in globalization, digitalization have created some quite supportive basis for joint ventures across the globe, which we also could see in some of the case studies and examples for science diplomacy today. So you have focused your research, as we show in your, so also in your flash talk, on the history of science diplomacy, and picked up some examples that were striking, also maybe of where it failed and what can be done when we learn from it. So keeping that historical perspective in mind, how do you view the current state of the matter? And specifically, can that governmental support that you mentioned advance technological and scientific innovation? I mean, isn't it a contradiction that a state funds research without being the main beneficiary of the results, or what are the solutions here?
Yes, thank you. So you found out about my war studies affiliation. Yeah, there's some level of cognitive dissonance there in my job too. So whilst I argue for a more robust posture in defense, I argue for more communication and more science diplomacy. I think we're doing it all wrong with Russia. So just to say it as I see it, I think science diplomacy has worked well in the past, and it can keep channels of communication open. And there's not so many examples that we can compare the Russia situation with. The only one that came to my mind is Iran in 1979. So it's that extraordinary that we've cut off all the ties. Yeah? And in the German case, this wasn't ordered by the federal government. It happened by free volition, out of free volition of the agencies. So I think that's interesting too. I mean, there's good reasons for it, I understand it, but it's really extraordinary. But having said that, and I see fragmentation or decoupling in inverted commas from Russia and especially China, that can serve as a brake on science diplomacy. But at the same time, the momentum is still very strong. Never has science diplomacy been more mainstreamed, at least in the German federal government, as today. In scale and scope and ambition, there's really no precedence. I think that's the good news. And in the German case, that might be a bit of a specificity. The science diplomacy has a very strong development cooperation element to it. And that it has only grown over the past 15 years. I mean, so no other country has invested so much in sort of research infrastructures abroad. And this brings me to your last question. So is it ironic or is it contradictory if a country sort of invests a lot of research money and doesn't get that much out of it? Yeah. But of course, seen from what I call a global structural perspective, so the more we want to solve global problems, the more we need to include global South voices. So seen from that perspective, that changes the paradigm of research funding, right? So it becomes more cosmopolitan in a way. So you don't sort of the national interest doesn't figure as much. Of course, it's still important, yeah. But this can explain why the government sort of accepts this, right? That maybe a large part of the research funding will have to sort of go abroad to help fund and professionalize the research infrastructures to help solve these global problems. And the solutions will be good for us too.
Yes, I think we're slowly approaching the end of this stage part of our discussion. Maybe I can have one final question to all of you before we turn it over to the Q&A. We started our discussion with looking at the concepts and the history of science diplomacy and the reasons for its current popularity. We looked at case studies, identified many active actors, institutions and networks, including governments and the private actors. And I'll now just play the devil's advocate for just 1 minute, and I will ask all of you science diplomacy. So why do we at all need this term and focus, right? Some say that science diplomacy is nothing new, it's just a hype, it's a fashion word, for something we have been doing all the time, and anyway, it's just a soft, quite powerless tool compared to the, let's say, international collaboration when it benefits the national interests, mainly in the fields of national security and economy. So how would you respond? Please.
Well, one was, it made rather than calling it just science and international affairs, it made it popular. That was the great achievement 15 years ago with the AAAS report. It energized a lot of people, particularly from the scientific community and young people. So I think it's not that it changed, that was occurring before that. There were certainly things that you could call science diplomacy going back a long way. So I think that in itself was an achievement. That's why there's an audience here today, I think, in part.
Okay, so energizing us, yes, Derya, what do you say?
I think it is not a lofty or soft, concept, and it is still working out, especially raising the awareness about this collaboration and competition. But I think Paul Arthur Bergman is also here. When we started to talk about science diplomacy, we also started to talk about, how the countries go beyond their national jurisdictions, for example, in the polar regions, different topics. And it's so good that right now, through this academia, many young people, I'm still coming to talent, they are more aware of the importance of these diplomacy, this, competition, collaboration. So I think science diplomacy is good, especially when we look at the more, upper levels to create healthy ecosystems of competition. So competition is important, but it should not only with the like-minded countries. So how we are going to deal with the other not like-minded? I think this is the question. I mean, Germany and the US can always collaborate, but how about the others? And how the science diplomacy should be also inclusive in terms of, these different actors, gender. I think we are all discussing because of this science diplomacy concept. So it's, I think, necessary and it should go, but not overly, emphasized and, it's not romanticized as Tim Flink says or Pierre Bruno. But I really highly recommend, because at the previous question, for example, through this science diplomacy, we edited 2 important books. One of them is a special section. It is published under Oxford University, Science and Public Policy, and it is on science diplomacy in Global South. And right now, there are different perspectives from Global South on science diplomacy, and many people are reaching out to these information. And another very good edited book, online book, you can reach out from Frontier's website. It is all about development and diasporas through the eyes of science diplomacy. So these are all the, the contributions of science diplomacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This side of the table.
I guess we're going in order.
So I would say that as the thinking around science diplomacy advances, it's forcing us to define or crystallize what these terms mean when we're referring to, for instance, actors. In the age of AI, we're starting to have to think about AI as an actor in the science, in the diplomatic landscape, and in the geopolitical landscape, because AI, we have to plan for the future. We have to pursue that guiding northern light. And basically, the idea is, if AI is an actor and it has agency and it has the ability to make decisions and it has the ability to play in the theater of war, we have to kind of readdress our game theory of how we evaluate collaboration versus competition versus, for example, the US and China. There's now a third actor in that theater, and so it's no longer this two-dimensional plane of, or two-dimensional game theory board. It's actually a three-dimensional Rubik's Cube. That z-axis is AI, and the reason AI is transcendent and rises up on that z-axis is because it acts within both the multilateral parties and across the parties, and it also has agency itself. And then in addition to that, to understand a three-dimensional Rubik's Cube of game theory, you essentially need AI to help digest that combinatorial complexity. So I think that our understanding of the interactions that are happening in foreign policy and geopolitics is rapidly advancing with science diplomacy, and this edited volume that we're working on, I think, is going to rapidly advance that conversation.
I also think the science diplomacy concept is very fruitful. I mean, of course, we've been doing, if we look at the practice, we've been doing this for a long time. Even though the American State Department organized a couple of conferences in the 1950s using that term, science diplomacy, and the Germans never sort of bought into that whole concept, and so that happened in the 2000s in Germany. But this concept is fruitful because, and it's valuable because it has focused the minds of politics, right, of politicians. And once you have a concept for this sort of amorphous practice, then you can come up with strategies and with goals. Right? And also it has shown to scientists that their international research collaborations are not ars gratia artis, right? You don't do it in and out of itself because it's a good thing to do, but also it can serve the national interest. And the other way around, it can sort of serve as a reminder to diplomats that science can be used, right, in the national interest also. Right? So I think it can lead to an interesting division of labor, but also interesting sort of cooperation between these two spheres.
Yeah, and I'll finish off, I guess, this panel by saying that a lot of times you hear people say this is soft power, and I think it has this connotation. What is soft? What is hard? I think we shouldn't assume that humanities is a soft. It's oftentimes called soft science, but I think it's hard. It's hard to do all of this. So I would call science diplomacy maybe not soft or hard power. It's smart power. So maybe we can think of it in terms of that going in the future, that we convene as we see here today. I mean, a lot of brilliant people. So there's a lot of smartness, innovation, and passion for this. So I would call it smart power, and I think we need a lot of that today.
So taking with us is energizing, is awareness, healthy ecosystems for competition, inclusiveness, including women and the global south, advancing the conversation, admitting that AI is the new dimension in that Rubik cube, showcasing the benefits between policy and science, and the smart power of science diplomacy. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot from our panelists that you can take home, and we want to learn even more if we have time for that with questions from the audience. Over to Jan. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we have questions who are in the chat on Slido, or if you want to use the mics, please find your way there. We'll take a couple questions before we have another short break before the final panel. So let's get started with question number 1 from Alexander. Can you speak to the tension between open science and IP, intellectual property patents? How can scientists and diplomats prevent walled gardens from suppressing fundamental research? Well, that's a light question.
So I already hear that Marcus can talk about that a bit, but yeah, go.
Sure, I'll comment briefly and turn it over to Bill as well. So I think what's interesting about AI in particular is that there's declining transparency in the research community, even across researchers. And so that's becoming more difficult to understand what's happening in the frontier labs. And then I think it's also interesting how, even within the same nation, across researchers in the same field, they're having walled gardens. And so, of course, you're going to experience that across the nations as well. And so I think that this is a very real challenge, and is a challenge uniquely cut out for, or science diplomacy is uniquely cut out for this, to basically be emissaries of science and to transmute that data into diplomacy, and that science that's happening behind the scenes into strategy that can be implemented. So it's not a soft power; it's a smart power. To be able to, in confidence, be able to communicate that information, that knowledge of what's happening in frontier labs, even if it's not being published in peer review journal articles, that at least policymakers that are aligned on the foreign policy objectives among allies can share that information and advance the common interest.
And also the other part of the questions, right, that just disappeared, the fundamental research. I mean, if we wouldn't have 20 years of fundamental research on the SARS-CoV viruses, we wouldn't be able to develop that vaccine so quickly. So, but Bill, you had a comment.
Yeah, just a quick story. For 2 years, I co-chaired a panel at the United Nations on the role of science, technology, innovation for advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason why that particular advisory committee was created, because the diplomats from the North and the South realized they got absolutely nowhere talking about intellectual property rights, whether technology should be given. So they said, we don't know the answer to that. We know we have to harness science and technology better, but we don't have an answer. So we need to give advice on what we can do in that regard. And what that advisory committee and its successors has sort of morphed into, a lot of more focus on capacity building in science technology in the world, in the global south, on trying to encourage countries to develop their own sort of roadmaps for how they can harness So their strategic plans combining their national goals, their plans for building their science and technology capacity with their plans for accomplishing whatever they think is important in the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's providing more support from, say, the advanced technology countries to the advancing emerging countries, building up their own capacity. They'll enable them actually to have their own IPR too as they develop this. So it's interesting how this impasse related to debating by diplomats over IPR sort of morphed into there should be much more emphasis trying to help build science and technology innovation capacity throughout the world.
Yeah, and now we have two related questions on ethics. Whose ethics will apply, and also how to bridge gaps in ethical orientation.
Yeah, it's surprising that ethics hasn't come up yet in this discussion. Christian?
Everybody's looking at me. I mean, the short answer is this is what state regulation is for, right? Or say laws, right? Research happens in a legal environment, in a legal context. So you can, I don't know, these are the goalposts, all right, of what's allowed, and then what lies outside of it is not allowed. And of course, then research funding can be conditioned in that regard. So I think I think it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but of course, this is one way of doing it. The other way would be, of course, to sort of come up in these research ecosystems, right, with a how do you call this? A consensus, right? And you get there through communication of what's allowed and what's not allowed. Yeah. So if you look at this as a habitus, right, in sociological terms, but of course the problem there is that still in some cases you will have contradictions and double standards.
Thank you. And I think, Ona, maybe this is a question for you. What are the potential disruptions quantum could present?
I like that. So I'll put on my quantum hat here and just say that there will be obviously positive and negative disruptions. So positive disruptions, I mean, something you probably have heard of, so drug discovery. It would be really nice if our organic chemists wouldn't have to spend, years researching one single molecule, and hopefully that, attaches to the right protein that cures the disease that we're looking at. So in terms of optimization, that'll be really useful for everything from drug discovery to materials research. We can just do so much, go through so much data, and make these decisions much faster. In terms of negative disruptions, and that's why we need our government to be much more proactive and instead of reactive. I think that has come up as well. So in terms of the negative parts is, for example, your data security, right? So you might think that your classical cryptography will protect you from everything that you need to be safe, but that's not the case because data mining is happening, and if let's say we don't do the right things in terms of thinking about already post-quantum cryptography, so all of that data that will be collected, they'll be just kind of open like that, if quantum computer, and it's not if, I think it's when it hits us. So that's a huge deal for everything from finance, right? So to our government, national security, and that's why our government is focusing so much on it. Yeah.
Thank you, Ona.
Jan, I think another related question was about education, how quantum is also affected, or the education. There was another, I think, question, but right now it disappeared. I think at every, I don't think any kind of scientific domain or research that is not going to be affected by AI. And especially research and education has been affected so much so far. And we don't know where to, because it's just started. Yesterday I was at the university and one of the professors asked me, when are you going to take a course? What kind of course? I asked. You know that you have to be taught, take a course about how to teach AI in your class and how to use AI in research and education. So these are all new things because all the researchers in not only the developed, also developing or underdeveloped countries to adapt themselves to all of these data, because data is produced, okay, but who's going to be able to access that? So education is all related to that, And if we don't really combine with ethics, with the others all together in research and education, I think the gap will be just bigger. So I don't know, this collaboration should be really in education too.
And to that point, just to spotlight one of our events that we've done actually in collaboration with also APS, for example, American Physical Society. So the academic societies, scientific societies, they work with us on this topic, and also the Embassy of Finland and Switzerland and SPIE as well. So we hosted an event, was it February of this year? It was focused on narrowing the quantum divide, and it was focused on education of quantum and then workforce also. So how countries that, for example, don't have a lot of resources, or we sometimes actually don't even know that they are doing quite interesting initiatives in this quantum information science and technology fields, like Chile, for example. We recently had a panel with a representative from their government, and believe it or not, there's a lot going on actually, and I think it's important to spotlight these efforts as well, in addition to everything that we do.
Well, we do have homework, right? We all can do something. There's homework in ethics and data security, in inclusiveness. So yeah, this is a start here. And Jan.
Well, thank you, Eva. Thank you to our panelists for another stimulating discussion. Thank you to the audience of offering us engaging questions. A round of applause for all of you. Thank you. We will have one more short break, and learning from experience, if I could ask all of you to be back in the room by 5 o'clock for our final panel, and we will then end up with a reception after our final panel. So thank you very much, and please reconvene here at 5 o'clock. Thank you.